All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Kaja Novatsky, and I'm an attorney advisor with ACUS. Throughout the month of November, ACUS has produced a number of panels as part of this forum on underserved communities and the regulatory process. The panel is the fifth one in our series, and this one will be focusing on learning from state and local agencies' efforts to engage with underserved communities. To find out more information regarding this forum and to view the previous panels from this forum, you can go to acus.gov. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Beth Williams. Beth served as Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department's Office of Legal Policy from 2017 to 2020. While there, she led the judicial nomination process for the department, assisting in the selection and confirmation of over 230 Article III judges. She served as the primary policy advisor to the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, and as the Chief Regulatory Officer for the department. Thank you, Beth. Now to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kaja. And on this week of Thanksgiving, I just want to say how thankful we are to all of you for joining, and of course to ACUS for putting this terrific forum together. And obviously, we're also thankful for Matt Wiener's terrific leadership and for Kaja's work in organizing this. And now I want to also thank and introduce our distinguished panelists. I'm going to introduce each panelist, and then that panelist will offer a few brief remarks. As you think of questions as the panelists are speaking, please feel free to type them in the chat, and then we'll be able to get to them toward the end of the session. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Professor Jonathan Collins. Jonathan is an assistant professor of education, political science, and international and public affairs at Brown University, where he also holds research affiliations within the Brown University Annenberg Institute for School Reform and the Brown University Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. His research examines how democratic processes can improve the educational experiences of students in low-income and minoritized communities, and the way in which people of color, particularly African Americans, engage with American democracy. Professor Collins.
Thank you for the introduction. I want to thank you to ACUS for inviting me and having me be a part of this larger conversation. And so, you know, what I want to talk about for a couple of minutes is just a bit about the work that I do and kind of what I've been finding recently, and then how I think this applies to thinking about regulatory systems, engaging with communities of color, and kind of being more thoughtful and precise about how we engage with these communities in particular. And so, you know, I'm a political scientist by training. My academic background is in political science. I have a PhD in political science from UCLA. But my focus is primarily centered around education, politics, and policy, and how we should think about education, politics, and policy through the lens of both race and democratic theory. And so, you know, one of the big kind of underlying, I would say, sort of critiques that my work has been looking to offer is this idea that when we look at low levels of civic engagement, especially in low-income and communities of color, we tend to focus on disparities between groups. We tend to look at how African Americans are participating or engaging in the electoral process or even non-electoral processes relative to their white counterparts. So we look at Latinx communities and offer these same questions. We look at low-income communities, and again, we offer these same questions about disparity. What I try to focus on instead is thinking about the work that institutions are doing or are not doing. So are institutions themselves committed to engaging with our communities? Are they committed to doing this in substantive ways? Can we think about and sort of imagine or reimagine ways in which institutions should go about this process of engaging with our communities? And so for me, you enter this idea of, or these ideas of participatory democracy and public deliberation. And so, you know, participatory democracy is this idea that's been brewing within democratic theory for a while, and it sort of reduces to the idea that direct participation between citizens, stakeholders, and their representatives is arguably the purest form of democracy, whether or not there's this actual direct contact happening. Deliberation and deliberation theory adds a sort of a caveat to that and argues that it has to be sort of communicative and rooted in dialogue. So you want to have back and forth exchange happening between members of the public and their representatives. And then you want that conversation to be rooted in justification and public reason, people providing justifications for their decisions, rationale, logical discourse. And so when you turn to communities of color, well, there seem to have been two things happening. One, the assumption that engagement can't happen here. And then two, the assumption that the idea of reasoned discourse is also not possible. And what I've been trying to do in my work is to push back against those two ideas. And so I've been studying initiatives or even designing my own that target these participatory and deliberation-based processes in communities of color. A most recent initiative, I partnered with the Central Falls Public School District, which is a mostly Latinx school district right outside of Providence here in Rhode Island. And we got the district to take some of their ESSER funding, their federal relief funds for COVID, and use this towards a participatory budgeting process. So what we did was we selected a subgroup of delegates from the community. They put together proposals based on a larger survey that they collected of people who live in the Central Falls community. They developed those proposals in combination with the district and some district bureaucrats to get a sense of how the money could be used and what ways it could be spent. And then they put together a final election day where community members from all across the city could come in to the high school gym, see the proposals on display, talk to their delegates who had put them together, and vote on the proposals that they ultimately felt would help the school district more. And so, the short victory here was the fact that most of the community members ended up endorsing investments in extracurricular programming, which on our surface, if we talk to district leaders beforehand, this wasn't necessarily something that they had on their radar. So it sort of changed the trajectory of the agenda that the local district operated under. But I think the bigger things were the strengthened community ties that we noticed amongst the delegates, the feeling of power, empowerment, and engagement and involvement that we noticed from them as well, and the sense that at the end of this process, there was a stronger appetite for more money to be decided through this kind of process, and for this process in and of itself to continue not only through education, but other ways in which the public operates. And so I tell this story about this research endeavor just to sort of lay a breadcrumb towards a larger trail. And that larger trail leads to this idea that we need to be thinking about how we can substantively engage communities of color in processes that are rooted in direct participation in this idea of deliberative discourse. And I think this is the next step in branching out and really making government agencies even more useful and productive, especially in the communities that need them most. And I'll leave it there.
That's terrific. Thanks so much. And thank you for that concrete example. I think that really gives some meat to what we're talking about today. So next, I'll introduce Linda Roman. Linda is the Deputy Health Policy Advisor at the Office of Oregon Governor Kate Brown. She also serves as the coordinator of the Racial Justice Council's Health Equity Committee. Prior to her work in the governor's office, she worked to expand access to health care and held leadership roles with the Oregon Latino Health Coalition and the Oregon Health Equity Alliance. During her time there, she spearheaded statewide policy campaigns to secure over $56 million for healthcare coverage for undocumented children and immigrants. Linda?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Linda Roman. And recently this year, I've had a change in role. I'm actually the Racial Justice Council Policy Advisor in the Office of Governor Kate Brown in Oregon. I'm excited to be with you all today to talk about the work of the Racial Justice Council. We started the council in last year in 2020, where we really just began to be intentional about how we listen, how we respond to, how we engage with communities across the state in Oregon around racial justice. Since we have been meeting close to over a year now, we have advanced a policy agenda and also a budgetary agenda. And the core goal of the Racial Justice Council is really to peel a couple of layers around access to the governor, access to the executive branch and to agencies, and to engage with communities before we develop our policy platform and budgetary platform. What we've been able to do is really peel a layer of so much of how this policy and budget framework usually happens within our agencies, and also within processes that may not be accessible to all communities. And so we have taken an approach of really peeling that layer off and opening and engaging with communities on racial justice. We have advanced a legislative agenda over the last legislative session and have focused our work in reviewing and implementation of those budgetary items. It really is I would say an ongoing conversation. It's definitely not a one and done type of engagement where we engage with the communities on various different topics that range from implementation of a certain policy to even big things that are happening at the governor's office that we want to make sure that we advise with the community. Overall, we engage with close to 250 individuals. We have the Racial Council that is chaired by the governor. And then from there, we have specific subject matter committees that range from 30 to 40 or 20 to 30 different people across the state. These committees have representation of various communities, various expertise, and representation from across the state. The other thing that I'll say is as part of the intent of the Racial Justice Council, we wanted to move beyond the inform. Many times when government entities or government agencies, we come to communities to talk to them when we're informing them of our work. We're sharing what we're doing. We want to get their feedback. But for the most part, the cake is already baked, to use an analogy. What we're doing is starting that process before the Governor Brown uses an example of, it's part of the recipe. Racial justice has to be part of the recipe, and it has to be a central component of our work. The other piece that I did want to share is we recently passed a bill, House Bill 2167, to codify the structure within the executive branch. What this bill does, it continues the commitment for future governors and the work of agencies to continue to engage with the Racial Justice Council. So it's now in statute. It requires our agencies to engage and support the work of the Racial Justice Council, and to also participate in a process with them to develop their future budget requests that they submit to the governor later on. And so what this means is that our agencies will be engaging with community before they build out their budget. And that's a really important step to ensure that we are integrating key improvements to the way that we fund our work within our agencies, and also that we make investments that are strategic in closing disparities, but also investments that create opportunity and the ability for all communities in Oregon to experience wealth and joy and health and housing. So that is really the focus of the Racial Justice Council. And with that, I'll turn it over to Beth.
Great, thank you so much, Linda. Next, we have Lisa Soronin. Lisa is the Executive Director of the State and Local Legal Center. In this role, she files amicus curiae briefs to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of members of the Big Seven, a group of nonpartisan, nonprofit organizations made up of U.S. state and local government officials in cases involving federalism. And she organizes moot courts for attorneys representing state and local governments at the Supreme Court. She also is a resource to Big Seven members on legal issues affecting state and local government, particularly at the Supreme Court level. Prior to joining the SLLC, Lisa worked for the National School Boards Association, the Wisconsin Association of School Boards, and clerked for the Wisconsin Court of Appeals. Lisa?
Thank you, Beth. It's great to be here with all of you today. So I'm going to focus on my remarks on the regulatory work that I did at the National School Boards Association. I assume listening in the conversation is a lot of lawyers. And so at the 10,000-foot view, what I would say is, and probably this is true for most of us, administrative law was one of the hardest classes I took in law school because it involved things like, what should happen to planktons and other things that I didn't really know anything about. But more to the point, I left the class thinking that the regulatory process was odd and complicated, and my education didn't prepare me very well for what I ultimately ended up doing, which was spending about 10 years of my career regularly responding to requests for comment on federal regulations from federal agencies. So for about a 10-year period, I did almost all of the commenting on federal regulations for the National School Boards Association. And I was lucky to be able to do it. We had 4 lawyers, so there was enough resources. Commenting on anything ranging from things that went on in schools that affected students to employment regulations, those sort of thing. Now, it may seem to many of you listening that schools wouldn't per se seem like an underserved community, but if you think about it this way, Wisconsin, for example, has 426 school districts. That means like these school districts are tiny. And if you think about this, like the Department of Labor is going to propose regulations on the Fair Labor Standards Act that are going to affect every single employer in the United States. If schools didn't speak up, their voice wouldn't be heard. So like I said, we're not a conventional underserved community, but the analogy is sort of there. So what I did basically was let me back up and say, I worked with 50 state associations. They actually had created the National School Boards Association. And one of the things that they struggled with was staying on top of federal regulations generally. So these attorneys working for like many national school boards associations in their state. So I literally started reading the Federal Register and looking and seeing what affected schools and saying, these are the things we should comment on. I ultimately put a publication together that followed everything in the Federal Register that was relevant to schools. And I'll say this, I don't ever remember being contacted by a federal agency when a regulation was proposed or before it was proposed that affected schools. It was 10 years ago and I wasn't super high up in the organization. So it may be that other people more important than me were contacted and no one told me, but I did the work so anything I did, I had to sort of figure out myself, which isn't too much to ask, but it maybe, kind of explains where, some of these national organizations are coming from. So all good conversations do things in threes. So I will make 3 recommendations, but it's important for me to have this caveat, which is that the most important work that you would do to help serve underserved communities probably doesn't involve national organizations, but that's my area of expertise. So that's what I want to sort of, I want to comment on. So I think to the extent that there are national organizations that represent the people that you want to hear from, it may be the case that you don't hear from them because they don't know what you're doing and they don't know how to react to what you're doing and how to be a part of the process. I think, at a minimum, it would have been amazing had I, in the job that I had, not had to have found all the regulations myself and figured it all out sort of from round one, like, how do I comment? What do I do? How does this process work? So to the extent that your agency or you're dealing with an agency that's dealing with an underserved community that is represented by a national organization, if you had some proactive interactions with that national organization to let them know, hey, we're doing this, I think that would be helpful. I think the other thing too is doing regulatory work is very special work. You have to have the time, the resources, and the imagination for it. And I think a lot of even well-funded national organizations, unless they have not just a lawyer, but someone who is skilled at gathering information, summarizing information, I built the whole thing from the ground up. And I think like it would have been easier had I walked in on day one of my job and was like, this is the process, this is sort of how you do it. And, training national organizations to respond to you may sound crazy, but on the other hand, if you're in the national organization and it has no structure to do that, either someone has to come up with it or it won't get done. The last comment I would make is this, and this has more to do with substance when it comes to regulations. So I only got involved in things after a rule was proposed. And I definitely did a lot of work. It was very gratifying, where I would make suggestions and the agency would listen, or at least would say, I'm not doing what the National School Boards Association said for this sort of reason. But what frustrated me was that oftentimes the changes in the regulations were more or less at the margins, and they weren't the regulations that I would have necessarily created had I been starting from scratch. And what I saw in regulations kind of over and over again, and this of course relates to schools, it doesn't necessarily relate to the underserved communities that you're probably most interested in, but I think the point will be the same. What I saw over and over again was that regulations assumed that they were regulating large entities with a lot of resources. And the regulations that were selected or proposed made sense maybe a little bit in that world. But I was saying over and over again, no, we don't have a lot of resources and we're not very big. So you've come up with a system that works for an imaginary organization that you've created, or at least one that doesn't represent the people that I work for. And I think had I been able to have made a difference before the proposed regulations were proposed, I always felt like I was working from behind, and I was behind. So that's my experience and my suggestions.
That's great. 3 points like a good Supreme Court advocate. Thanks, Lisa. So next we have Dion. Dion Williams is the Deputy Executive Director at the Colorado Department of Local Affairs. The Department of Local Affairs works in partnership with local governments and communities statewide to provide funding for projects, disaster recovery relief, affordable housing, community planning, and equitable administration of property tax law throughout the state. Prior to joining the department, Dion served as the Executive Director of Denver's Office of Children's Affairs and had leadership roles in several Denver agencies. She's an advocate for using the resources of local government to promote equity, remove barriers, and ensure every member of the community is included in long-range plans.
Thank you, Beth. And what I want to say today is really kind of pulling together what several other people have mentioned. And I come to this state relatively recently, having worked for a number of years at the local level. And I think that gives me a really interesting perspective in seeing how sort of the regulatory environment trickles down to the local level and seeing how it works and also how it doesn't work. And especially in communities of color, when we're talking about engagement and thinking about that regulatory framework, what I would say, and kind of jumping off what Lisa was just talking about, is the earlier you can engage and the more you can really think about how communities of color perceive that federal environment, I think the more successful you are. A lot of times what I think works really well is when you understand that for underserved communities, everything is local. Everything really is about what's happening within that community, and that they don't really necessarily resonate very well with sort of that federal way of looking at regulation and rulemaking and that kind of thing. But everything is really happening at the local level, and you have to engage early, and you have to engage with what they really need, and not necessarily from this, what I kind of think of as the field of dreams approach, where you build it and they'll come. You know, you build a service, you build a program, and you just turn it on and people are supposed to show up and utilize it. That doesn't really work very well. And what works better is if you really think about engagement from a perspective of what you're listening to what people need, and thinking about how are you building that into rulemaking, how are you building that into regulatory framework, and engaging from that level early enough in the process where what you're delivering is really more of what people are going to actually utilize. I think that's actually a better way for engaging underserved communities. I've seen a lot of times where you we'll have some sort of federal program or regulation come down the stream at the local level, and people wonder, well, why aren't people taking advantage of it? Why isn't this working? What are those barriers? And it's because that engagement didn't really happen, or it happened too late. And a lot of times it's happening in communities of color. And I think it's happening because that engagement was poor or non-existent. And I think that's probably that frustration that Lisa is pointing out, and that's why. I also think that you have to think about sort of what that technical assistance looks like in communities when you're talking about engagement and sort of that regulatory environment. If we really want to do a better job of engaging, we have to understand sort of translating for folks what that regulatory framework is, and how that makes it into local communities, and who are the people who are showing up and advocating, and how do we make sure that we have the right voices at the table when we're talking about doing that sort of engagement and doing that sort of representation. You know, who are the ones who are translating what regulations look like. So when we're doing things like rulemaking, for example, and we want to make sure that people are represented, you know, from a school district or in a particular, you know, zoning meeting or that kind of thing. You know, who is actually representing the local communities, and how knowledgeable are they, and how are they getting prepared to do that kind of representation and bringing that to the table. I think one of the things that's great about having an organization like Local Affairs, which is kind of unique that we have in Colorado, is that we're able to sort of bridge that gap between local government, local communities, and state agencies and the federal government, and rolling out programs, and kind of navigating between the federal regulations, trickling down to the local level. And so when you have an organization like Local Affairs, and you have staff that are able to sort of navigate that process, I think it's really helpful when we have more success in creating that sort of the sort of bridge for engagement. So the more that you have those kind of organizations, I think the more success that you'll be able to have. But I think the earlier that you can engage and the more you can embed that into your processes, the more success you'll have in really bringing along communities of color, and underserved communities in these types of regulatory frameworks. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dion. And finally, we have Professor Neil Woods. Neil Woods is a professor at the University of South Carolina, where he teaches courses on public policy and public administration. His research focuses on how political and administrative institutions affect policy outcomes, especially in the areas of environmental policy and regulation. He's published over 30 articles on these topics and has won various awards for his research and writing from the American Political Science Association. Neil?
Thanks, Beth. And thanks to ACUS for inviting me to this panel, which is really interesting. You know, like Jonathan, I'm a political scientist. I study regulatory processes, particularly at the state level in the US. And I guess I'm going to frame my opening remarks in terms of reaffirming the value of this entire endeavor through the lens of legitimacy. And legitimacy is important for administrative agencies because, you know, they occupy a kind of a unique role in American democracy, where they don't have the normal mechanisms that we usually think of as imparting legitimacy to public decisions, because we don't have any electoral connection a lot of times. And so we can't reward or punish administrators based on policy decisions that they make through the normal electoral means. And this has led a lot of people to have concerns about the democratic legitimacy of the administrative state just in general. And there's been a lot of talk in legal circles and academic circles about, you know, the processes by which we can give administrative decision-making more legitimacy. And the typical suggestions are to open the process up to more participation. And so there's a general perception among a lot of folks that procedural openness, procedural fairness, these are the kinds of things that give agency decision-making legitimacy. And this is embodied in a lot of work, including some papers that ACUS has put out there about, you know, the ways that we can impart greater legitimacy to decisions that are made by administrative folks in administrative agencies through administrative processes. But I would say that there's an increasing recognition among political scientists that procedural openness in and of itself is probably not enough. And that it's not necessarily the openness of the procedures themselves, but that it's how these procedures are used in terms of who participates and the way that this participation manifests itself in terms of whether it's really a dialogue or not, and these kinds of things. These are the kinds of things that tend to matter more, generally speaking, in terms of public perception of legitimacy of agency decision-making than just open procedures themselves. And so the relationship between procedural openness and at the federal level in the United States, so the classic example of this is the notice and comment period process, right? And so everyone has an opportunity to present comments, and a lot of discussion goes into how do we get a broader representation among commenters. And part of the reason that we have this process, part of it is to make better decisions, but part is also to give some legitimacy to this process. But experimental work in political science that's very recent, that's focused on this issue, tends to give the indication that this legitimacy imparting part of this process is more complex than just opening it up to people. In fact, if you give people, and I've done some of this research, so if you give two conditions to survey respondents, one in which you clearly lay out that this process was open to everyone and that there's widespread participation, et cetera, and another where you don't say anything about that at all, you don't have any differences in legitimacy perceptions. At least in some of these studies, including some of the ones that I've done, they come to that conclusion. But what does matter in some studies is the diversity of the stakeholders that are consulted. And so that if you indicate that there was a wide range of interests that are consulted, and this includes people on both sides of the issue, and this includes people who might be disadvantaged in some way or something like that, then you get a legitimacy benefit. And so it's the diversity of stakeholders consulted, it's the possibility of deliberation among stakeholders, and it's the overall transparency of the process that tend to lend legitimacy, research suggests. And so that gives, I think, further indication of the importance of trying to open this process up and get more participation from underrepresented groups.
That's great. Well, now we'll open it up to questions. And just as a reminder, if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. But I have some questions just to start with. And so I'll pick up on what Neil said. You were talking, Neil, about the notice and comment period and the federal rulemaking and how that works. And so I was wondering if you could talk a bit, and then hopefully we could get Dion and Linda too to add in about how state and local agencies might differ from the federal government with respect to regulatory policymaking, and how does that affect underserved communities. I think a lot of our audience for ACUS is often federal policymakers, either in agencies or federal academics who are studying these. So can you talk a little bit about the differences with state and local?
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that. And so some of the research that I've done is looked specifically at these different mechanisms that are employed by state agencies in the course of their rulemaking. And I have some slides that I had prepared to present about this, but I'm on a different laptop for technical reasons. So I'll just tell you some of these differences. Basically, in my research, I divided them up into a couple of different areas. One of which I called public access and one of which I called public notification. And so public notification would consist of things that are required of states, usually in state administrative procedure acts, although sometimes these are required in other state laws or executive orders. But required of just generally across state agencies in terms of who they need to inform, the mechanism by which they inform people, and the length of time that they have to respond, essentially. And so at the federal level, of course, we have to publish rules in the Federal Register, and that's not necessarily true at the state level. So at the time I did this, so this just, there's a caveat here. These data are as of about 2007. So they're a little bit dated, and there probably have been some changes. But as of that time, 35 states out of the 50 did require it to be in the official, published in the official state register, but the other 15 didn't. And 2 or 3 states, depending on kind of how you count, basically had no requirement at all, or the requirement was to mail it to an interested person if they're interested. Now there were 13 states that required it to be posted in newspaper. And so there was some kind of sort of newspaper announcement that was required in the state APA or wherever. This is one thing that I think has probably changed since 2007. So I didn't, at the time I compiled these data, I didn't look at any requirement in terms of posting on the internet. And I suspect that's much more widespread now than it was at that time. I looked at the amount of time that people had to respond to these things, the minimum lead time that was allowed for responses to these calls for comments. There was 9 states that had lead time required of up to 20 days, 29 states up to 30 days, and 12 that had more than 30 days. I believe that the most was 100 days, which might have been in Tennessee, but I'm going from memory there, so I might be wrong. And so there was wide variation in that. There was wide variation in the delay before rules become effective. So some of them were effective immediately upon adoption. That a state agency could promulgate a rule and that day start enforcing it in theory. And then they went up to about over 20 days. So all of that I considered sort of notification kinds of things. I also looked at access mechanisms, and the sort of quintessential public access mechanism would be the opportunity to present written comments to the agency, which is obviously guaranteed at the federal level for most rulemaking. At the state level, it's usually guaranteed as well. At the time I did this, 47 states had a requirement for it. I believe it's 48 now. The 2 states I believe that do not require agencies to provide an opportunity for written comment are Michigan and New Mexico. But beyond this, there are a variety of other things that states could require state agencies to do. So 30 some states require them to have the opportunity to have a public hearing before adoption. Let me see if I get this right. I said 30 some odd. I think it might be 30 states that do require that. And so there are some requirements for public hearings. There are some requirements that states impose on state agencies to promulgate a rule upon request by the public, if the public petitions them to do that. There are states that require them to do a cost-benefit analysis of a rule if there's a public petition requiring them to do that. There are states that require that the public may petition an entity reviewing the rule to review a rule, such as an entity in the governor's office, or in some cases, the state legislature to review an existing rule to determine its applicability or legality. And so there are a variety, it's really a very broad array of different mechanisms that states give their citizens to participate in the rulemaking process.
That's great, thanks. And Dion or Linda, could you talk a little bit to your state processes and maybe how they might differ from the federal government regulatory process?
Yeah, absolutely. I can share here. So with the Racial Justice Council, we've asked them if there are specific rules or implementation processes that they wanted to especially track and monitor. We recently have been tracking a restorative justice program that we recently funded over the last year. And there has been a lot of discussion around this program because it's actually the first time that our state has funded a restorative justice program that is centered around community investments and really moving away from a carceral type of restorative model. And so what we've done is we've talked extensively with the agency that's in charge of implementing and developing a process for the administrative rule we've asked them actually within the statute that created the rule and the program, there's a piece around community engagement. So we've been working with the agency on the back end to help design what that process could look like. Because there was so much interest in this, we've also had a handful of members actually participate in that process. And what's been great is, as an example, is the agency that has been leading the process of feedback and for the rule for implementation. They've actually been keeping us updated about the progress, the draft language, and we've been sending that out to our council members to provide feedback. And it's actually been, I will say that this is a new way of engaging because you have a community partner and an agency coming together to share kind of where the process is at and places to engage in that process. I will say that there are some agencies that haven't gotten a chance to do engagement over the administrative rule beyond just posting notice, right? And there is a culture of this is just what we've done, right? There isn't an engagement process or this is just what we do, right? This we don't do this. What we do is we post it, and those who are interested, they engage in that process. So I also want to acknowledge that we have agencies in that continuum who are just starting out, who have never done this, and we have some, like the example that I gave, who does have some experience with sharing and doing that co-creation around what the process looks like, how to set up the process so that there is multiple opportunities to provide feedback beyond the kind of traditional sign up for this portal and submit your comment through there, so we've been really looking at various ways to engage in that process.
That's great. Dion, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, at the state level, we do have a rulemaking process that includes public comment, that does include, a regulated process for written comments and public hearing on rulemaking. That's similar to what Neil was describing. I mean, at the local level, it really depends. I mean, every local entity in the state of Colorado, at least, it's all over the board, depending on which local government you're talking about. The city of Denver has a pretty well-established rulemaking process, and so it kind of depends on the local entity. Though I do see a couple of the questions in the chat talking about sort of who is participating in those processes, and I do think there's probably a lot of work to be done around, just thinking about who is actually representing local communities and representing particular populations and participating in some of those hearings and rulemaking and kind of thinking through that. And that's an area where I think probably every state, when we're speaking at the state level, can look at sort of their process and thinking about that outreach and understanding how their rules around rulemaking maybe could be looked at with a different lens if we're talking about engagement in underserved populations and how they're participating. But it's pretty similar to what Neil was talking about.
Great, thank you. So my next question is what are the biggest problems that you see with respect to engagement of underserved communities in regulatory policy making? I mean, from my perspective, it seems like folks who are, working all day, one, maybe two more jobs, maybe have childcare responsibilities on top of it, are not necessarily using their, half-hour free time a day to read the Federal Register. And so what are the biggest problems that you're seeing? Jonathan, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Sure. I think, just kind of from my own work, you need some sort of intermediary introduction to engaging with government agencies. And so, the first attempt and I think it's best when that intermediary attempt is something centered around collective engagement as opposed to something that's more so individual. And so it can't be the first time that we have an encounter is when person is either sort of filing complaint or one is sort of subject to some sort of violation. It has to what I'm finding is that people are really responsive to these more collaborative, collective processes where they can, because the thing about engaging communities is that it's just that you're engaging communities, and it works much better when you're engaging folks, as members of communities. And, you want to think about the folks on the agency side as people that are not just ensuring that a public service or a public good is delivered. You want to think about them as people that can help facilitate the overall sort of growth of civil society, of strengthening the sort of social and civic fabric of these communities. And so I think, again, having these processes be set up in ways where they can be collaborative, community-based, and really iterative, where processes lead to more attempts to be engaged in more processes.
Lisa, I don't know if you have anything to add to that from your experience with the School Boards Association. Do you see, and you talked a little bit about just getting the information as part of the problem. Do you see that as the biggest problem with respect to engaging underserved communities?
So I'm trying to think about how to answer this question, like sort of intelligently and coherently. And it's like a thought is sort of generating in my brain, but I'm not sure I can quite get it out. One of the commenters asked about the legitimacy of national organizations. So let me start there. The reality is that for most rulemaking that's going to happen at the federal level, as far as I could tell, and the people who are listening would know better than I, the bulk of the comments that are probably going to be substantive are going to come from national organizations. Because for the reasons that Beth said, like individuals don't have time, interest, knowledge, whatever to sort of comment. And one of the challenges that has got to be the case when this comes up is that I just think about like when I was at the National School Boards Association commenting on behalf of school districts. Like I said, in my own mind, my voice was always kind of the underserved. And that underserved in my world was the small and rural, because that's where I was coming from, where I came from professionally. That's what I didn't hear in the regulations. But the point is, like, there was a regulation designed towards schools or designed towards employers. And I was able to respond as a school person, as an employer person. It may be that in every single regulatory context, you want to hear from underserved communities, but it may not be that there's an underserved community that's designed to comment on regulations for schools. Or it may be that underserved communities like are in schools, but I was like the more traditional underserved that you're talking about here, people of color, people of low income. I wasn't talking about that perspective when I was talking about the school perspective, and I couldn't talk about every perspective. So I'm trying to say something that it's just difficult for me to articulate. And what I think I'm trying to say is that the question for you all who are receiving comments from people and want to hear from particular communities is you have to ask, is there a community organized enough to give you comments? Or it might be organized in 5 or 10 other organizations that don't focus just on race or just on poverty or whatever. And so you may not be able to get the voice that you want because it's not organized properly. And even if it is, like there's a great voice organized on schools and racial issues. I mean, there is, but like, are they focusing on federal comments? Are they doing a million other things? So I think like that's a dilemma. I hope that was comprehensible to someone other than me.
Yeah, I understood it. So thank you. Thank you for that. So now I'll open it up to some of the questions in the comments. And the first is what Lisa, I think, was just responding to. So the question is, responding to Lisa's point about rules presuming compliance by large entities, a simplistic cost-benefit analysis would suggest that regulators get more ROI from a small number of entities that impact a large number of people. If regulators are influenced by that analysis, what would you say to encourage a different point of view? Oh, sure, Lisa?
So, I mean, I don't want to nitpick the question or purposely try to misunderstand it, but I think like at the end of the day, regulations are driven by law. So who is regulated is who's sort of like legally required to be regulated. So the agency doesn't necessarily have a choice to say like, oh, I really want big people to comply, or I really want small people to comply. Like anyone who's regulated has to comply. Now, that said, I think there are some instances where there'll be exceptions for small entities or things like that. But I think that the question comes from a perspective that's a little bit inaccurate. And what reality is that the agency doesn't get to choose usually who it regulates. It regulates who the law says it has to regulate.
That's helpful. Does anyone else?
Yeah, I would just encourage a both and thinking that you may find yourself in an instance where you are engaging a wide mass of people, but you also may want to have feedback at a more local, like who directly is impacted or who helps navigate people who are directly impacted. I think that way you can kind of get, a wide range of perspectives. We recently are implementing a bill to fully expand healthcare coverage to all adults, regardless of their immigration status in Oregon. And we found a lot of value in talking to hospitals and the health systems who are more, like to your question, more of that broader kind of framework. But it's also important to talk to as well the people on the ground that are encouraging people to sign up, the people who actually would sign up and have doubts about that. That way you kind of get a holistic kind of viewpoint of how to approach the issue, and just also where you might not see some apparent gaps. That's really where we found out that it's really important to have partnerships at a clinical level where they do reach the masses, and also critical to have really strong community validators to talk about the new program that would be established through the rule. So I think both and thinking it is really beneficial to help really gather a wide range of perspectives and feedback of how folks will be impacted.
Great. Okay, well, the next question from our audience is regarding legitimacy of the process. It says, because of the complexity of rulemaking, regulators rely on associations and intermediaries to speak on behalf of large swaths of people. Do we have significant evidence that these intermediaries have legitimacy themselves as non-elected representatives of various populations? What can agencies, associations, or third parties do to validate that group voices indeed reflect a diverse set of perspectives? So whereas the organization may not have polled its members, maybe before submitting comments, I think is what the question is going to. Do any of you have thoughts on that? Sure, Lisa?
So I wonder if Dr. Woods has anything from a research perspective, but as someone who did this for a national organization, I mean, that was a dilemma. Here I was, 28 years old, 3 years out of law school, and I was commenting on all these regulations, and I knew what I knew. I didn't know what I didn't know, and I did the best I could. I mean, in my mind, but absolutely there were instances when I pulled the membership, when I tried to find out a variety of solutions, but sometimes I was kind of flying blind and just kind of using what seemed to me like common sense. You're always limited by the resources of that national organization, and you're limited by the human being that does the job. And I can't say I ever put my name on something that I wasn't sure of or wasn't confident in, or that I thought was merely guesswork. On the other hand, it was a humbling process, and what I knew and what I was able to find out was limited. And so I can't answer the question of legitimacy, because that would involve me knowing how people perceived what I was doing, which I don't have an answer to. But what I can answer is it was challenging. I didn't have everything that I needed to know. And I did try. I thought about legitimacy, not in that word maybe, but I knew my work had to have credibility. I knew it had to be real. And I tried to do everything that I could. But I was limited in what I could do.
Neil or Jonathan, is this something that you've looked at, whether the organizations that are submitting input are actually submitting representative comments, or do any work to make sure that they are?
I'll jump in first. No, I haven't actually looked at that, and I'm not aware of anyone who has. Maybe Jonathan knows something because he looks at a different set of literature than I do. But at least the kinds of work that I'm looking at, the stuff that I referenced is relatively recent experimental work. It's maybe in the last 5 years this has come out in a variety of different studies in the U.S. setting and other countries, usually at the national level. And usually the way that people ask about participation is just these very broad statements, you know, that this rule was made without consultation or something like that, versus this rule was made with broad consultation with lots of different affected groups, versus this rule was made by a consultation process that primarily involved the regulated industry, for instance. And so these kind of dynamics about whether groups are representing their members, that's probably the next step down the road for some of this research, but I haven't seen it addressed.
Lisa, did you want to jump in again?
I don't want to dominate the conversation, but this is like sort of where I spent a lot of my time. I just thought about this as we were talking. In the job I have now, I actually did file comments once, and it was on a very technical subject matter. And what I did is I hunted down a national association that hired the unique employees that worked on this subject matter. They knew nothing about the regulation, even though it would have affected their employees directly. What I did was I did this with another individual. I wrote like a sketch of like the legal stuff and the big picture stuff. And then I would say to them, like, sometimes I would try to write the technical points myself. Is this true? Is this correct? Or I would say like, you got to fill in the detail here. What is your experience? And so I found a technical partner to help me. And this is a partner that, like I said, had no idea this even existed. And it was amazing. And it was really good. And I couldn't have done really as good of work without them. But I started out thinking like, oh, I can do this myself, and realized, no, you can't. And I was fortunate that they were like, okay, we'll do the research. We'll answer your technical questions. We'll say yes, we'll say no, we'll save 20%, we'll pull our members. So I'd like to believe the process is legitimate and that the people in it try to make it as such. But I wonder if the people that read my comments saw like, hey, what does the National League of Cities know about something really technical related to websites? But when we had these like website employees, maybe it looked better.
That's great. Well, I know we're coming up on time, so just final question. In your experience, do you believe underserved communities are more engaged at the state and local level? Or do you find that maybe because news is so much more national now, that the engagement is actually not greater at the state and local level? So I was wondering if the panelists could maybe give their 30-second thoughts on local engagement.
Well, I would say in my experience, again, I think for underserved communities, everything is local. So I think they're very engaged at the local level, more intensely so. And that's where if you can catch them there and help them become more engaged at the federal level, they stay that way. And so that's my sense of it.
Jonathan, do you have thoughts?
Oh, sure. I think it depends on the issue. And so we're seeing this play out in real time. And I see this in a lot of my work on the politics of school boards. And so like right now, you see school boards lit on fire by critical race theory, feelings about critical race theory. Whereas those same school boards, when discussing issues that are more idiosyncratic to the more sort of everyday administrative behavior of the district and the sort of administering of education, then you see much more sort of agreement and opportunity for collaboration. And so I think, and high levels of engagement or varying levels of engagement. So it's going to depend on the issue. You know, we have to think about what are the issues that are going to just resonate with the public at large, attract a certain level of participation, and then lead to the kind of changes in policy and outcomes that lead to more and more participation. Good results beget more and more civic participation, and that's always going to be at the center. And so, but again, the national versus local, all politics is local. I agree with Dion. The question is, you know, issue by issue, you're going to see some variation.
And Linda, do you find the same?
I would just say that there needs to be more. There absolutely needs to be more. And as government entities, we have to, explore how to create more access into our services. We are served better when we engage with communities. Our programs are better. They're more accessible. And I would just say this last almost 2 years of the pandemic has really illustrated that we need to upgrade, we need to morph, and we need to move at the speed of community trust and need. And that is with urgency. And so I think there's a lot of value in beginning the inquiry and work to engage with communities of color and Indigenous and tribal communities.
Great. Well, I see that we're out of time, so I just want to use this final few moments to say thank you in this week of Thanksgiving. Thank you to ACUS. Thank you to all of our panelists for this terrific event today. And I want to remember to mention that there is one more panel, the 6th and final panel of the forum. It's called Expanding on Efforts to Engage with Underserved Communities. It's next Monday, November 29th at 3:30 Eastern. So thank you to everybody and have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Take care.